I'm excited about our next presentation because these are two folks who know a lot about ransomware. I have worked firsthand with Kroll looking at ransomware intrusions, and I can say Lori, Tony, and a lot of folks over there really know their stuff. And I'm particularly excited about this topic and this talk because ransomware, of course, such an important topic. I would argue one of the threats that every organization needs to worry about. But I think we so often hear about the big names, REvil or Conti, and there are a lot of different types of ransomware operators. And so I'm particularly excited to hear from Lori and Tony about maybe a slightly different take on ransomware that you've heard before. With that, Lori, Tony, take it away. You should have slide control, but I'll hang out until you confirm that.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. So as Katie said, my name is Lori Iacono. I'm a Senior Vice President with Kroll Cyber Risk. I manage the day-to-day of our cyber threat intelligence team. So I work very closely with incident response folks like Tony, and I do a lot of kind of looking across our cases to try to identify, strategic trends or threats that we should notify our clients of. So I'm a former English major. So I'm one of those humanities people that made their way into cyber threat intel. I really enjoy reading. So if you have some favorite cybersecurity book recommendations, be sure to leave those for me in the Slack chat. And I also teach cybercrime and cyber intelligence at University of Pittsburgh and Robert Morris University. And I'll let Tony introduce himself next.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Tony Knutson. Coming from you from the very cold Minneapolis, Minnesota. Little bit about my background. I've been doing this about 10 years inside digital forensics, inside all of the major sectors, federal law enforcement, private sector, academia, and obviously with consultancy here at Kroll. I am a bit of a cert hoarder. I am a 1099 SME for the digital forensics classes for SANS. So I've had the luxury of being able to work with a lot of the instructors over the time. And this is obviously a very big passion of mine is with threat intelligence. We're really hoping that you enjoy this talk.
Yes, so our talk today is lone wolves, how ransomware has evolved into freelance work. And for our agenda this afternoon, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about kind of like a history lesson on ransomware as a service. We're also going to talk, about specifically what we see in Kroll and how all of the ransomware as a service activity has kind of set the stage for a type of actor that Tony and I are kind of calling the lone wolf. And then after I'm done, then Tony will go into more of like an IR case study example of our team working together very closely with IR to uncover some intel related to kind of an unknown actor, and as well as some key takeaways at the end. So Tony, if you want to go to that next slide. So this slide here, this is just representing kind of the total percentage of different threat incident types that we see in our IR cases at Kroll. So that top navy blue line, that's representing ransomware. And except for Q1, when we kind of had an anomaly because of how many Exchange proxy logon cases we saw, typically ransomware is by far, takes up the most percentage of our IR cases. And if we move over to the next slide now, it's actually been that way since about August of 2019. And it was in August, it wasn't that we didn't have ransomware before that, right? We always had that. It's just that we had a smaller percentage of it. We usually would have more things, maybe like email compromise. But in August 2019, we kind of saw the first time it was the shift into ransomware, and it's pretty much stayed consistently like that since that time. So that's about 3 years now. And a lot of what we have seen with that is these groups that are operating this ransomware as a service model. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with that model as us who kind of, live and breathe it every day, essentially ransomware as a service, or RAAS, is, it's kind of a business model for a ransomware gang in which the kind of top level operators may focus on things like software development and PR and management, and then they actually outsource the distribution of the ransom ransomware to a network of affiliates who then get a percentage of that ultimate ransom. And definitely what we've seen, across our cases is these are equal opportunity attackers. So we've seen, companies of all sizes, reputation, sector, and revenue be hit by these type of groups. So if we go on the next slide, we're kind of going to go back in time for a minute to 2019 and some things that happened. I mentioned that shift happened in August 2019, and let's talk about something that happened a couple months before that, which was the retirement of the GandCrab ransomware group. This was a very public retirement. And at that time, they claimed that they had made over $2 billion US dollars in 18 months of their operation. And we have no way to vet that claim about how much money they made, but I think the takeaway there was a significant amount of money was made during that time. Now, they maybe weren't the first group to use this RAAS model, but they were certainly the ones that kind of popularized it to the extent that we're seeing today. So a lot of the groups that have been following since then have kind of copied the model that they had put into place. So if we go over to the next slide, this is May's ransomware group. This should be familiar to a lot of people. So another kind of history lesson with ransomware as a service is we saw this addition of new tactics in the past 3 years that these groups are using. So it's no longer just encryption, it's encryption, there's also exfiltration, and then they're threatening or they are posting it on their actor controlled shaming sites. So May's News, this was one of the first sites to May's was one of the first ransomware groups to actually carry this out. So May's News was one of the first sites in December of 2019. Since then, we've kind of had a proliferation of this, and we definitely see this tactic being used in our cases. In 2020, we saw, this tactic associated with about 40% of our cases. And in 2021, that statistic was about 90% of our cases involved this kind of tactic. So if we move over to the next slide, talk a little bit about, some of the other tactics. So they're not just doing the exfiltration and the shaming sites. So we've seen things like threatening DDoS during negotiations. So Avedon, which is no longer active, and Suncrypt, they were two of the groups that did that, as well as, but even as recently as like a couple weeks ago, we saw a pretty I think it was like a 10-day sustained denial of service attack on one of our clients during some negotiations with Black Hat. So that's definitely a tactic that these groups are still using. Cold calling is another one. So during the negotiations, they'll call employees, maybe checking to see if they got the ransom note, or pressuring them to pay the ransom, as well as these emailing customers of the victim. So this example here on the right side, this is by the Clop ransomware group, and they were basically going after customers of a victim, thinking that if the customers are worried that their data is going to be put up on one of these shaming sites, they may pressure that victim organization into paying that ransom. So one of the interesting things, we're seeing in the ransomware ecosphere on the dark web is, there's a lot of services now. So they've kind of broadened out, they're using all these different tactics, and there's a lot of groups that maybe are specializing in these kind of tactics. So there may be a group that's providing the DDoS, or a group that's providing the cold calling and the fraudulent call centers. And basically, all these different services are kind of catering to those ransomware as a service operators. But what that means is that other threat actors can then take advantage of them. So on the next slide, initial access broker. So that's probably, that's definitely one of the growth areas that we've seen on the underground, catering to these RAAS operators. And essentially here we have, an image from an auction page, and they're basically selling off validated credentials to, different VPNs, so Pulse Secure, Citrix, things like that. And how we kind of see that in our cases is a lot of times, if we find patient 0 for the ransomware incident, then if you look, maybe 2 months, 6 weeks back, you'll see one kind of unauthorized or suspicious login to that account. That's probably the initial access broker doing kind of the first test. And then you won't see anything happening. This would be kind of dormant. And then you see the actor who's actually launching the ransomware campaign actually comes in at that time. So this is definitely a tactic now. Like I said, even though they're catering to the larger ransomware as a service operations, this is something that now any threat actor can easily take advantage of. So if we look at the next slide here, I want to talk a little bit about insider threat. So, when we think about our organizations, as our organizations get bigger, there's more risk for insider threat, right? So think about some of these ransomware as a service operations. We know that they're operating, they have sometimes hundreds of different affiliates, and they have hundreds of different now like suppliers that are, doing these kind of niche services for them. So it means that there might be more people in the ecosphere that are now, disgruntled or maybe have a bone to pick with the operators. And for us, from an intel perspective, that's fantastic, because that's all the things that we can data mine for information. That's not so good, obviously, for the operators. But sometimes the way we see that play out is, maybe discord on the forums between actors about lack of payment. We also see sometimes source code or things like that will be dropped. And as I said, that's all great from an intel perspective. This example here, this is probably one of the most kind of like high profile examples of this insider threat. This was in August of 2021. Disgruntled Conti affiliate basically dumped kind of what was like the training manual that they would give to Conti affiliates to help them, basically like instructions on lateral movement and privilege escalation once they're in a system. And there was, a lot of information, like I said, that we could mine from this for, intel purposes. But this is also a lot of information now that, maybe a threat actor who wasn't good enough to get hired as an affiliate could then take this information and have this blueprint. And there's kind of a fun fact related to this specifically. One of our interns, when he was pulling all this information down, there were a couple different Conti leaks around the same time, and there was a bunch of videos. And he actually found that a bunch of the videos that Conti was providing to their affiliates were actually like, it was his professor at college was doing these pen testing how-to videos for an educational platform. And Conti was actually sharing those videos with their affiliates. So he was able to go back to his professor and tell him that he was doing such a good job that he's actually helping out cyber criminals. So that's kind of a weird story. So on the next slide, and this is actually the last one that I'm going to talk to, but all of this kind of decentralization that we're discussing, all of this kind of discord amongst the groups, and information that's now out there in the public sphere about ransomware activity, this is all kind of resulting in kind of lowering the bar to entry for threat actors. So this is why we think we're seeing this rise in these lone wolf attackers. So I guess the question is, like, what is the difference, right? Like, why does it matter if it's like a RAAS affiliate hitting me versus lone wolf attacker? So there's a couple of reasons, from like intel and defense perspective. Part of it is, from the intel side, these kind of actors kind of complicate things for us. It definitely complicates attribution because you have so many actors using, things with the same indicators. So we, had a case recently. We had like 3 different cases where we were seeing almost identical indicators and TTPs across all the cases. And at least for 2 of them, we knew that it was possible they were related because it was in the same family of ransomware. But for one of them, it was a completely different ransom note. Now, when our, examiner team kind of saw the similarities, they said, they kind of felt like it was probably very likely to be the same threat actor. But when we did, like a deep dive into all of that information, what we found was that almost all the indicators and tools they were using, even down to like host names, were things that were easily for purchase out there on the dark web. So it didn't really, mean just because they had the same things that it was actually the same threat actor group. So it definitely makes attribution harder. And then from a defense perspective, so I have the pyramid of pain here on the slide. And, with the pyramid of pain, you're thinking of network defense kind of in terms of how much pain it causes your adversary if you block certain indicators, right? So it's really hard to block indicators though when you don't know what those indicators are, right? So for the larger RAAS groups, there's, you know, they're operating at such a high volume that there's a lot of open source reporting that's out there in the community. So someone, you know, may be able to know kind of what the Conti playbook is and what that looks like, and then they can take the right blocking and detection steps in their network. But if you have a lone wolf attacker that you're dealing with, you know, this may be the second time they've ever launched ransomware. So you don't really know the playbook that they're going to come at you with. And, you know, that kind of takes me to my next point about these lone wolf actors. Tony and I were talking, because we went through a lot of cases kind of, you know, planning for this presentation. And, you know, one thing that we were kind of saying was, you know, typically when we're talking about lone wolves, we're kind of thinking of a lower, like less sophisticated actor, I guess. So sometimes there's a lot of damage affiliated with these attacks. So I kind of came up with the analogy of it's kind of like putting out a candle with a fire hose. So yeah, they're gonna, you know, launch the ransomware, or you're going to put out that candle, but you're going to leave a lot of damage in your wake. So some of the things that we've seen are things like data deletion, data destruction. You know, Tony's told me lots of stories about systems being completely fried after one of these actors gets done with them. And then there's also, you know, there's a potential, you know, sometimes they will encrypt the network, but actually, like, you know, it can be decrypted without purchasing their decryptor. So their encryption actually didn't work that well, which is a good thing. But there's also the flip side where they could actually encrypt the network, but then they don't actually have the right decryptor for that information. So even if you pay them the ransom, that doesn't actually mean that it's going to decrypt your network. So just kind of knowing, you know, which one of these attackers is hitting your system is really valuable in kind of, you know, informing your response process or next steps to this. So I'm gonna pass the torch over to Tony now, and he's gonna talk more about some of the differences in a case study from our IR practice.
Thanks, Lori. So shifting from the CTI and going a little bit into the IR world, I feel like this is something that will help the greater community to kind of understand, if you've never been in an incident response role, what the mindset is. And we'll start with that very briefly, even just looking at the difference between a RAAS and a lone wolf. From my perspective as an IR person, I see a RAAS as a conglomerate enterprise. They have all the sections you would imagine inside of a company. They have a finance division, they'll have a PR division, they've got a IT support division when it comes to things. It's very structured when it comes to stuff. Lone wolves, on the other hand, you're more than likely dealing with a one-off, maybe a low group of individuals that are doing all of it. Where that significant difference is going to really hit is what it matters to them. And a lot of that comes down to how a RAAS works compared to how the lone wolves are going to work. RAASes are looking at bigger fish. They will target many, many companies, but they can specifically go and target larger companies or larger entities based on an assortment of different mechanisms, either via credential harvesting themselves and selling it, or they go and find those larger companies that they find a weakness in a CVE, such as proxy logon, zero logon, where a lone wolf, they're looking at it as, what can I do to move very, very quickly through this? And where that becomes the big thing with lone wolves is they're going to move without really knowing what they're doing. And a lot of the attacks that they're looking at are very novice in how they approach these. Ransomware as a service groups are going to be very explicit, and it is following a playbook. We saw that with Conti. When you get into a lone wolf, you really don't know what you're going to get. And that really does become the big difference between these two. Lori hit on it very, very good on the destruction of your network. If they can get in and they have no seeming ability to understand how that encryption works, they could fry your network without any intention to do so. And you're really at a loss at that point. They can't really help you with anything. You're obviously not paying. It's not good for them. They kind of get upset about that, but they learn, they move on. And for our case study, this was a group that had an affection for horses. It was a little odd for us when we saw that, but we kind of went with it. So the big thing with this is we had to break down silos. From an IR perspective, I'm looking to get to my leadership team or to my client everything they need to be able to make sound decisions quickly. That means I'm not really digging for a lot of things that potentially could be beneficial, but is it really what they need? And what we saw with this one specifically is this was in the summer of 2021, so still fairly recently. Our IOCs were very trivial. By that I mean Mimikatz was on there, still named Mimikatz. The encryptor was named encryptor.exe. We were not showing any signs of exfiltration through log files or other traditional digital forensic techniques. From the ransomware extension, it was really odd. We had never seen this in Horse We Trust extension in any engagement before. We were a little just kind of taken back by that. The ransom note only really contained a IRC channel username and an email address for them to reach out to. This really went against a lot of the normal things that we would see with a ransomware as a service group, where they're going to lay out specific things that they want you to do. Here's our shaming site so you can see that we mean business. Here's our contact site so you can get into the department with our customer help so we can start the negotiation phase. Here's how much money we're looking at with the default that they have put inside of it, or obviously that will maybe coming down the road. That stuff was not inside of this at all. We could have really just left it at that and kind of gone with it. However, our curiosity got the best of us, and we went and started looking at things. With what Lori's team was able to do was pull back some of that information that we were seeing a lot of the high profile RAASs starting to dissolve, or they were going into an idle mode due to the bigger events that happened into the early summer months of the US with the Colonial Pipeline, and then with the Kaseya exploit as well through our evil and with dark side or dark matter. And then we had dissent with Conti coming down. That playbook was released, I believe, in August of 2021. So a lot of this was kind of going on just before we started seeing this group kind of come into here. So what they did is they were able to start just doing a lot of OSINT. And they took those email addresses and they took that ICQ number and they started looking to see if they could figure out who this person was. And this is what it looked like on the actual ICQ location. If you were to do some of this OSINT, they were able to find a different name with that we were able to pivot on. From there, the mail that was in here, we were able to take and link in later on to VirusTotal and to some other external analyses that email was found in, that we were starting to basically put a picture together on who this actor could have been. And really what it ended up coming down to is we found on some very shady Russian blog site that there's a genealogy website. I put the link down in here. We'll have it on the last slide as well. That allowed you to show a genealogy of these encryptors based on heuristics and commonality or code reuse inside of them that started to link them together. And what we started to kind of figure out, and I'm kind of glad I have the mouse on here, is we found that our horse guys were actually being part of a parent, which was part of a parent, which was part of a Phobos as the primary, which obviously goes back to the Dharma as the creator of it. So we were able to start to see like, okay, this is what it is. So, but we need a little bit more confidence than that. And this is where a lot more of your security operations center kind of comes in handy, and a lot of research from our CTI team. What we were able to find out, and we'll have some of the links here in a second, is a lot of these activities were actually happening back in 2018, but it was very, very small. And we couldn't see what was going on with them because it was small. And these were types of activity that weren't really happening in the United States or happening in other regions of the world. But as soon as some of these affiliates most likely were starting to get disgruntled or wanted more money, what better way than to go out on your own and freelance? So we started to look inside the technical considerations. And this is a screenshot of the strings of the encryptor.binary as it was uploaded to VirusTotal, not by us, but by some other individual that was on there. You can see it's not encoded, it's not obfuscated, it's not packed. That is typically things that we would see with ransomware as a service, because they have a whole malware team that literally is developing that stuff, trying to make it as difficult as possible for anybody to reverse engineer it. And when we take it and we put it up against a Xed hamster with the guarantee, which was supposed to be the parent group, we can see that we have almost a 1-for-1 coming across this with how they are actually laying out the attack from that binary. We ended up with a very good thing of high confidence that, all right, like we've got these two pieces inside of there based on what we were seeing. And with that, we were able to show like, okay, we've got this too. We feel pretty confident about that. Getting into Phobos, BlackBerry, and Malwarebytes ended up having terrific write-ups of things that we were able to demonstrate inside of those same binaries from both those families that were still being seen inside there. A lot of them are typically what you would see and a couple other things, but because same thing, it was not packed, it was not obfuscated, it at least led us to a mild bit of confidence. I wouldn't even really say medium, but we felt fairly sure that we could at least say, okay, we're not the only one that think this. BlackBerry almost, I think, flat out said in there that this is Phobos, and they actually had one of the horse binaries that they actually analyzed inside of there. So our big key takeaways to this is, from an IR perspective, giving your CTI team all of this information allowed us to give our leadership and our clients way better information based on what it was. We started to feel a lot stronger on the things that you needed to really be strong about, which would be data exfiltration. When it came to this, it was one of the only things that we really couldn't prove or disprove based on the forensic artifacts. This allowed us to have a bit more confidence when we were talking with them, to be like, you really don't need to worry too much about this. We're not seeing anything based on what the binary was doing to do any of that kind of stuff. And we're not seeing some of these other forensic artifacts when it came to this exfil. And based on other reporting, we're not seeing anybody else indicate that that is something to be worried about. So it was a massive win-win to have our threat intelligence and our incident response teams actually working together on that. And the last slide before we get into the references of what we've kind of talked about inside of here, this is still something that's happening on a day-to-day basis. This is the screenshot to the In Horse We Trust binary that we have in here analyzed. Last time it was submitted was on the 4th of January, so just only a couple weeks before this. So these attacks are still happening. So it is something to just be aware of when it comes to this. You know, you're dealing with freelance individuals that you never know when they may hit. And lastly, if anyone needs to contact Laura or I, that would be our contact info. And thank you so much for your time.